Note on the theme, Technical Progress is Always Ambiguous, by Jacques Ellul, appended to the essay, The Technological Order. It cannot be maintained that technical progress is in itself either good or bad. In the evolution of technique, contradictory elements are always indissolubly connected. Let us consider these elements under the following 4 rubrics. 1. All technical progress exacts a price. 2. Technique raises more problems than it solves. 3. Pernicious effects are inseparable from favourable effects. And 4. Every technique implies unforeseeable effects. 1. All technical progress exacts a price. What is meant here is not that technical progress exacts a price in money or in intellectual effort, but that when technical progress adds something on the one hand, it inevitably subtracts something on the other. It is always difficult to interpret satisfactorily the bald statement that technical progress is an established fact, because some people cling to traditional social forms, tending to deny any value at all to such progress and deeming that nothing can be called progress if it casts doubt on established social values. Other persons, on the contrary, hold that technique produces extraordinary things of a prodigious novelty, bringing about the consequent disappearance of all sorts of valueless junk. The fact is that, viewed objectively, technological progress produces values of unimpeachable merit, while simultaneously destroying values no less important. As a consequence, it cannot be maintained that there is absolute progress or absolute regress. Let me give a few simple examples of this reciprocal action. In the first place, let us consider the fact that modern man, thanks to hygiene in particular and to technical progress in general, enjoys a greater lifespan than ever before. Life expectancy in France today is approximately 60 years, compared, say, to 35 years in 1890 and 30 years in about 1800. Footnote: I must remark that I am very skeptical of the way in which mean lifespans are calculated for periods antedating 1800. When the historian says that life expectancy was 20 years in the 13th century, his statement can hardly be looked upon as more than a mere joke. There are no means, in principle, of establishing life expectancies for the past. But even with this indubitable extension of the average lifespan, all physicians are in agreement that proportionately to this extension, life has become very much more precarious, i.e., our general state of health has become very much more fragile. Human beings of the present have neither the same resistance as their ancestors to disease or to natural conditions, nor the same endurance. They suffer from a certain nervous fragility and a loss of general vitality, sensitiveness of their senses, and so on. In the 60 years during which such studies have been carried out, regression in all these respects has been marked. Thus, though we live longer, we live a reduced life with nothing resembling the vital energy of our ancestors. It is clear that diminution on the one hand has been accompanied by augmentation on the other. In the sphere of labor, the technical progress of the present has effected a considerable economy of muscular effort. But at the same time, this progress has come to demand a greater and greater nervous effort, so that tension and wear and tear on our nerves have inversely increased. Here again, a kind of equilibrium has asserted itself between savings and expense. To take an instance from the sphere of economics, technical progress allows the creation of new industries, but a just view of the matter would compel us to take into consideration the accompanying destruction of resources. To take a French example, the so-called Lac case is beginning to be well known. An industrial complex for the exploitation of sulfur and natural gas has been established at Lac, a simple technical fact. But from the economic point of view, this is far from being the case, since a serious agricultural problem has arisen because of the excessive destruction of farm products in the region. Up to now, the government has not seen fit to take the matter seriously, although it has been officially estimated in reports to the Chamber that for 1960, agricultural losses have aggregated 2 billion francs. Now the vineyards of Jurançon are being attacked by the sulfurous gases and are disappearing, a not inconsiderable economic loss. To calculate from the economist's point of view the profits of an industry of this kind, it would at the minimum be necessary to deduct the value of what has been destroyed, in this case 2 billion francs. It would likewise be necessary to deduct the very considerable expenses of all the necessary protective devices, hospitals, which incidentally have not yet been constructed, schools, in short, of the whole urban complex which has not yet been brought into being, but which is nevertheless indispensable. We must have knowledge of how to calculate the whole. The Lac enterprise, counting all the expenses of which we have been speaking must be reckoned a deficit enterprise. Our last example has to do with the problem of the intellectual culture of the masses. True, today's technical means permit a mass culture to exist. Television allows people who never visited a theater in their lives to see performances of the great classics. Paris Match, through its articles, allows masses of people who would be in total ignorance without such articles to attain to a certain literary and even to a certain aesthetic culture. But on the other side of the ledger, it must be recorded that this same technical progress leads to an ever-increasing cultural superficiality. Technical progress absolutely forbids certain indispensable conditions of a genuine culture, such as reflection and opportunity for assimilation. We are indeed witnessing the creation of knowledge, since we are in possession of the means of knowing what we could never have known before, but it is nevertheless a superficial development because it is one which is purely quantitative. The intellectual no longer has any time to meditate on a book and must choose between two alternatives. Either he reads through a whole collection of books rapidly, of which little later but a few fragments survive, scattered bits of vague knowledge, or he takes a year to peruse a few books thoroughly. I should like to know who today has the time to take Pascal or Montaigne seriously. To do them justice would require months and months, but today's technique forbids any such thing. Exactly the same holds for the problem of the musée imaginaire, which Malraux has put so well. We can be in contact with the whole painting and sculpture of humanity, but this availability has no cultural value comparable to that enjoyed by Poussin, who, in his voyage to Rome, passed several years in studying, statue by statue, the ensemble of artistic works at his disposal. He clearly knew nothing of Polynesian or Chinese art, but what he did know had infinitely more educational value for him because it penetrated his personality slowly. So, once again, we see that technique allows us to progress quantitatively to the level of culture spoken of, but at the same time interdicts us from making any progress in depth. In the circumstances, is it really possible to speak of culture at all? All technical progress exacts a price. We cannot believe that technique brings us nothing, but we must not think that what it brings free of charge. 2. The problems posed by technical progress. The second aspect of the ambiguity of technical progress concerns the following point. When technique evolves, it does so by solving a certain number of problems and by raising others. The further we advance into the technological society, the more convinced we become that in any sphere whatever, there are nothing but technical problems. We conceive all problems in their technical aspect and think that solutions to them can only appear by means of further perfecting techniques. In a certain sense, we are right. It is true that technique permits us to solve the majority of the problems we encounter. But we are compelled to note, perhaps not often enough, that each technical evolution raises new problems, and that, as a consequence, there is never one technique which solves one problem. The technological movement is more complicated. One technique solves one problem, but at the same time creates others. Let us take some simple examples of this fact. We are well acquainted with the details of the gravest sociological problem faced by the 19th century, i.e. that of the proletariat, a problem which we are only now in process of solving, with difficulty. The phenomenon of the proletariat is not to be considered a simple one, and Marx himself did not describe it as merely the exploitation of the workers by certain wicked capitalists. His explanation of the proletarian condition was very much more profound. He demonstrated that the proletariat was a result of the division and the mechanization of labor. He expressly states that it is necessary to pass through the stage represented by the proletariat. For Marx, therefore, the problem is not, say, a moral one with bad guys exploiting good guys. Marx never puts the problem in this way. He always poses it as lying outside good or bad moral qualities, external to value judgments, and on the level of fact. And the fact is the fact of the division of labor and of the machine, giving rise to a society in which exploitation is inevitable, i.e., drawing off surplus values. The phenomenon of the proletariat is therefore, even in the Marxian analysis, the result of technical progress. The machine and the division of labor allowed, from the economic point of view, an extraordinary expansion, but at the same time, and as a result of the same movement, posed the social problem which it has taken a whole century to resolve. Let us consider in the same way the extension of the above problem as it appears in the questions which will eventually, but certainly, be posed by the so-called automation. Again, automation is not just another simple economic fact. Indeed, we are gradually coming to realize that it will entail difficulties which, from our present point of view, can only be characterized as insurmountable. First of all, automation implies a production of goods in a relatively constant series of types. This means that when production has been automated, it is no longer possible to vary types, so that an unavoidable condition of immobilism with regard to production must ensue. An automated production line, considered in its full context of operation, is so expensive that amortization must occur over terms so long that the exclusive production of certain types of goods without any possibility of modification must be a consequence. But, up to the present, no commercial market of the capitalist world is suited to the absorption of the production of an unchanging line of goods. No presently existing Western economic organization on the commercial plane is prepared to find an answer to automated production. Another difficulty of automation is the fact that it will result in a massive diminution of the necessary labor force. The simplistic reaction to this problem will clearly be to hold that the solution is easy. It is not necessary to cut down on the number of the workers, but only to diminish the number of daily working hours of each. This solution is quite clearly impossible for a very simple reason. Automation cannot be applied to any arbitrarily selected industry or production, and this for reasons which are basic and not due to the temporary exigencies of, say, the money market. Certain kinds of production can and will be automated. Certain others cannot and will never be automated. Consequently, it is not possible to cut down working hours over the working class as a whole. There are industrial sectors in which the workers would conceivably work 1 hour per day, whereas in others the workers would have to continue working a normal day of 8 hours. Hence, as a result of automation, there will be extended sectors of the economy emptied of manpower, while other sectors will continue on the normal standard. Diebold estimates that in the single year 1955 to 1956, in the United States, automation reduced the total number of working hours by 7%. In the automated plants of the Ford Motor Company, there was a reduction of personnel by 25%. And in 1957, in industrial branches in which automation gained most, in particular in the manufacture of electric bulbs and in the very highly automated chemical industry, it was possible to dispense with the services of 800,000 workers. In other words, automation does not result in labor saving favorable to the workers, but is expressed through unemployment and employment disequilibration. It might be alleged that the situation described is true of capitalist countries, but cannot be identical in socialist. This statement is not exact. In socialist countries, the problem likewise is posed primarily because of socialist egalitarianism. The problem is the same for the Soviet Union, for example, where automation is commencing as for the United States. There will be specialized workers in some industries who will be freed from the necessity to work in one way or another, while in other branches of industry, the 8-hour day will have to remain in force, a situation clearly unacceptable to the egalitarian theories of socialism. A second problem is bound to arise in connection with the retraining of the liberated workers for jobs in new industrial sectors, in which there is a shortage of manpower. But such retraining, more often than not, presents enormous difficulties, since the disemployed worker is generally semi-skilled or unskilled, and a completely new apprenticeship is implied of such a nature as to steer him toward other branches of industry. A third difficulty occasioned by automation is the problem of wages. The wage problem produced by automation has, up till now, not been solved. How is it possible to fix a wage scale for automated industrial plants? It cannot be done on the piecework plan, machines do all the work. It cannot be done on the basis of time put in on the job. If it is desired to reduce unemployment by reducing the workday to, say, 2 or 3 hours, a given worker would only be employed for a very short period each day. Should such a worker then be paid according to a wage schedule which pays him for 2 hours of work at the equivalent of a worker who must work 8? The injustice of such a procedure is clear. How then should wages be calculated in an automated industry? One is forced to the admission that the relation between wages and productivity, on the one hand, and between wages and job time on the other, must disappear. Wages will be calculated only as a function of the purchasing power given to the worker with a view to maximum consumption by dividing the total production value by the total number of workers. Such a method is really the only one feasible. Since 1950 in Russia, it has actually been tried twice, but the results were unsatisfactory, and it very soon became necessary to return to the system of hourly wages, since in the present state of affairs, the necessary calculations prove unfeasible. But then the difficulties mentioned above, inherent in calculating either according to job time or according to production, return. And at the moment, wage calculation in automated industries is completely shrouded in uncertainties. Still, another problem is presented by the fact that modern economic crises most often result from a distortion between the different economic sectors, more exactly from unequal growth of the different sectors. Here, automation must prove to be an economic factor much to be feared. There will not only be disparity of economic growth between the automated and the non-automated industrial sectors, but still more between industry and agriculture. Either capitalist countries must look forward to an increase of crises due to automation, or they must adopt planning aimed at rectifying the distortions, and planning by authoritarian measures, as in the Soviet Union. At the present time, even the Soviet planners find that their planning is insufficient to meet the problems of automation, since it is not flexible enough, on the one hand, and not extensive enough to re-equilibrate the out-of-phase sectors on the other. Here, then, are a number of problems, and there are a great many others, with which we must expect to be confronted by the fact of automation, all of which furnish us with examples of our thesis that technique raises, in proportion to its progress, problems of greater and greater difficulty. Let me indicate one final example of this, i.e. the problem of overpopulation, resulting from the application of medical and prophylactic health techniques, the final result of which is the suppression of infant mortality and the prolongation of human life. The phenomenon of overpopulation, in its turn, produces the tragic phenomenon of underconsumption. A century hence, all of us, without exception, will be menaced by a general underconsumption, which will afflict the whole human race, if the expansion of the world's population increases. Here we are confronted by a problem clearly provoked by certain techniques, certain positive techniques. The common factor of all these examples is that technical progress raises whole complexes of problems which we are in no position to solve. Examples of such problems are literally innumerable. 3. The evil effects of technique are inseparable from the good. An idea frequently to be encountered in superficial inquiries concerning technique is the following. At bottom, everything depends on the way technique is employed. Mankind has only to use technique for the good and avoid using it for the bad. A common example of this notion is the usual recommendation to employ techniques for the beneficent purposes of peace and eschew them for the maleficent purposes of war. All, then, will go well. Our thesis is that technical progress contains simultaneously the good and the bad. Consider automation, the problem which we have just been discussing. It is indisputable that technological unemployment is the result of mechanical progress. It cannot be otherwise. All mechanical progress necessarily entails a saving of labor and consequently a necessary technological unemployment. Here we have an ill-omened effect indissolubly connected with one which is in itself beneficial. The progress of mechanization necessarily entails unemployment. The technological unemployment so produced can be resolved by either of two means, which are the only two means economically or politically possible: spreading it out either in space or in time. A capitalist economist holds that the solution to unemployment is that technological unemployment ultimately dies out of itself. This means that the workers who have been freed, the optimistic formula for unemployment, because of technical advances will ultimately find jobs, either by directing themselves toward industries with manpower shortages or through the fact that new inventions will produce new opportunities of employment and new vocations. The standard example cited in defense of this thesis is that of the vocational opportunities connected with the invention of the automobile. Admittedly, this technological device did suppress a certain number of vocations, but it brought innumerable others into being, with the final result that a vast number of persons are now employed by the servicing required by this industry. Hence, the machine in question has actually created employment. All of this is indeed true. It is nevertheless a terribly heartless view of the situation because it neglects to mention the interim period. It is all very well to say that the worker rendered jobless will, with the lapse of a certain time, again find employment, and that, after he has been reclassified, unemployment will die out. But humanly speaking, what is the situation of the unemployed worker in the interim? Here the problem of spreading out unemployment in time is posed. In the Soviet Union, unemployment of a technological nature which not only exists, but springs from the same sources, is spread out in space. By this I mean that when in one place new machines are applied and workers liberated, the affected workers will, without having to wait very long, receive a work card which tells them in effect 2,000 kilometers from here, a job has been assigned to you. You are hereby directed to remove yourself to such and such a factory. In one way, such a procedure seems a little less inhuman, but in another way it seems just as inhuman as the time procedure of the capitalists, since no account is taken of one's attachments to family, friends, locality, and so on. The human being is only a pawn to be moved about. It is hard to tell between the capitalist and the socialist ways of handling the problem which solution presents the worse indecencies. A further example of the inseparable mingling of good and bad effects is furnished by the noteworthy study of the American sociological historian J.U. Neff concerning industry and war. Neff shows how industrialism, i.e. the development of industry taken as a whole, necessarily prods industrialized societies in the direction of war. His analysis has nothing to do with the inner essence of industrialism. The phenomena described by him lie purely at the level of the human being. First, industrialism gives an increasing population the means to live. It is a law sociologically irrefutable that the denser the population, the greater the number of wars. This phenomenon is, of course, well known as a practical matter to all sociologists, but only Neff has studied it carefully. Second, industrialism creates the media of the press, transmission of information, and transport. And finally, the means of making war, all of which make it more and more difficult and even almost impossible to distinguish between the aggressor and the aggressed. At the present, no one knows, and perhaps no one can know, which side has commenced hostilities, a fact not solely due to armaments, but also to facility of transport. The extraordinary rapidity of transport allows an aggression to be launched within 24 hours, or even less, without anyone being able to foresee it. Here, the influence of the press is extremely important, since the press function is to confuse and addle the facts so that no one is able to gain any correct intelligence of them. Finally, Neff indicates that the new means of destruction created by industrialism have greatly reduced the trouble, the difficulties, and the anguish implied in the act of killing people. A bombardier or artillerist has no feeling at all of killing anyone. He is in fact able to reach the conclusion that he has killed someone only with the aid of a syllogism. In hand-to-hand combat, all the tiresome difficulties of conscience about the evil of murder keep obtruding themselves. In such ways, then, positive elements of industry result essentially, by very complex expedients, in favoring war, and even in provoking it, even if no one has the intention of using technique badly. Let us consider as a final example of the relation between good effects and bad effects, the press and information. It seems to be a simple matter, for example, to distinguish between information and propaganda, but closer study of the problem reveals that it is practically impossible to make such a distinction. Considering but a few elements of the situation, the problem of information is today no longer that of the necessity of transmitting honest information. Everybody agrees on this point. On the moral level, it is a commonplace that we ought to transmit true information. I merely inquire, how do we get it? To remain on the moral level is simply not to understand the situation. The concrete situation, to take but a single example, is something like the following. Over the wires and into the offices of the Associated Press pass daily up to 300,000 words of world news, approximately equal to an enormous volume of 1,000 pages. From this mass of words, it is necessary for the Associated Press, in competition with all the other world agencies, to choose, cut, and re-expedite as quickly as possible perhaps a 20th part of the whole to its subscribers. How is it possible to select from such a flood just what should be retained, what is true, what is possibly false, etc.? The editors have no criteria. They are at the mercy of whatever comes in, and even when they judge in good faith and knowledge, they must essentially judge subjectively. Then again, even if the editor had only true news, how should he assign it a coefficient of importance? To do so is his business, and here the stereotypes of the editor are true enough. The Catholic editor will deem the news of the latest Vatican Council of great significance, information which has not the slightest importance to the communist editor. What we have to do with here is not a question of bad faith, but of a difference of perspective on the world. The result is that we never know, even under the most favorable circumstances, if a given piece of information is subjective. And we must always bear in mind that this information, whatever it is, has been worked over by at least 4 or 5 different pairs of hands. My reasons for maintaining that good effects are inseparable from bad are now, I trust, clear. And as communications improve, the freer will be the flow of the news and the more available to all agencies concerned. These factors will play an ever greater role, making the difficulties of editing proportionately more difficult, and the chance of selecting absurd rather than sound news ever greater. 4. All technological progress contains unforeseeable effects. The final aspect of the ambiguity of technical progress resides in the following state of affairs. When scientists carry out their researches in one or another discipline and hit upon new technical means, they generally see clearly in what sphere the new technique will be applicable. Certain results are expected and gotten, but there are always secondary effects which had not been anticipated, which, in the primary stage of the technical progress in question, could not, in principle, have been anticipated. This unpredictability arises from the fact that predictability implies complete possibility of experimenting in every sphere, an inconceivable state of affairs. The most elementary example is furnished by drugs. You have a cold in the head. You take an aspirin. The headache disappears, but aspirin has other actions besides doing away with headaches. In the beginning, we were totally oblivious of these side effects, but I should imagine by now everyone has read articles warning against the use of aspirin because of its possible dangerous effects, say, on the blood picture. Grave hemorrhages have appeared in people who habitually took 2 or 3 aspirins daily. Yet aspirin was thought the perfect remedy a scant 10 years ago, on the ground that no side effects were to be feared. Now such effects begin to appear even in what was and is probably the most harmless of all drugs. Another spectacular example is that of DDT, a chemical which in 1945 was thought to be a prodigiously successful means for the destruction of all kinds of vermin and insects. One of the most admirable things about DDT was that it was said to be completely innocuous toward human beings. DDT was sprinkled over the whole surface of the globe. Then, by accident, it was discovered that in certain areas veal cattle were wasting away and dying. Research revealed that DDT in oily solution causes anemia. Cattle had been dusted with DDT in order to get rid of insects. They had subsequently licked themselves clean and ingested the DDT. The chemical in question passed into their milk and by this route found its way into oily solution, i.e. in the milk fat. Calves suckled by such cows died of anemia, and it is needless to add that the same milk was ingested by human infants. Identical problems are potentially raised by all chemicals consumed by animals or men. Recall the recent example of thalidomide. This is an example of the so-called secondary effects, effects which are essentially unpredictable and only revealed after the technique in question has been applied on a grand scale, i.e. when it is no longer possible to retrace one's steps. Another interesting example is furnished by the psychosociological studies of the particular psychology of big city dwellers, where, once more, we are confronted with the effect of the technical environment on the human being. One of the principal elements of big city life is the feeling of isolation, loneliness, absence of human contacts, etc. One of the leading ideas of Le Corbusier in his Maison des Hommes was the admission that big city dwellers do not know one another. Let us create, said Le Corbusier, great blocks of dwellings where people will meet one another as they did in the village, with everything, grocer, baker, butcher, included in the block so that people will get to know one another, and a community will come into being. The result of Le Corbusier's creation was exactly the opposite of what had been planned. Problems of loneliness and isolation in such blocks of dwellings proved to be much more tragic than in the normal and traditional city. Then it was held, and this is the penultimate word in city planning, that it was necessary to rediscover human groupings on a human scale, not on the scale of a block with, say, 5,000 separate dwelling units. In the works and writings of sociologists and of city planners of perhaps 7 or 8 years ago, we read, at bottom, the only ones who understood what a city was were the people of the Middle Ages, who knew how to create a true city corresponding to the demands of a genuine city planning technique, i.e. a human community centered about a small square surrounded by small houses toward which converge the straight city streets, etc. The new city planners, in keeping with these theories, applied them to the suburbs of Chicago, and in particular to the well-known village of Park Forest. There, it was thought, was to be found the distinctively human formula, one which really allows the human being his full scope. But the most recent sociological and psychological analyses show this model community to represent nothing less than a new and unexpected difficulty. This time, people are traumatized because they are perpetually under the eyes and under the surveillance of their neighbors. The affected group is indeed much reduced in size, but no one dares to budge because everybody knows just what everybody else is up to. A frightfully constricting situation, to say the least. it is clear that even with the best intentions and with the application of hypermodern and profound research in psychology and sociology, we only succeed in coming to results in every case which could not possibly have been anticipated. I shall give one last example of these unforeseeable effects, this time from agriculture, namely the massive cultivation of certain plants like corn and cotton. The cultivation of these plants in the new countries seems to represent undeniable progress. The deforestation of land too heavily forested is a felicitous operation, profitable from every point of view, and consequently represents technical progress. But it could not have been anticipated that corn and cotton are plants which not only impoverish the soil, but even annihilate it by the twofold action of removing certain natural elements and destroying the relation between the humus and the soil particles. Both these last are destroyed by the roots of cotton and corn to the degree that, after 30 or 40 years of cultivation of these agricultural products, the soil is transformed into a veritable dust bowl. A strong wind need only to pass over it to reduce it to bare rock. The phenomenon is worldwide and is to be encountered in the United States, Brazil, and Russia, among others. It is a bone of contention between Khrushchev and certain Soviet agricultural specialists. Khrushchev essentially emphasizes the cultivation of corn, as is well known. But many Soviet specialists insist that this emphasis is a very dangerous one. It allows a very rapid economic progress for, say, 20 years, only to be followed by a destruction of hitherto fertile lands which may last for centuries. The inquiries of Castro and Vogt have shown that, at the present, in certain regions, 20% of cultivated land is threatened with destruction in this way. If this factor is considered in connection with that of population growth, a very considerable difficulty seems to lurk in the offing. If arable land continues to diminish in extent beyond possibility of recovery, our chances of survival diminish correspondingly. Here we have an example of typical and unpredictable secondary effects which in corn and cotton agriculture do not reveal themselves except after 30 years of experience. It is again impossible, therefore, to say whether technical progress is in essence good or bad. We are launched into a world of an astonishing degree of complexity. At every step, we let loose new problems and raise new difficulties. We succeed progressively in solving these difficulties, but only in such a way that when one has been resolved, we are confronted by another. Such is the progress of technology in our society. All I have been able to do is to give a few fragmentary examples. What would be necessary in order to comprehend the problem in its entirety is a systematic and detailed study of all these points.